Today is August 21st, 2023. I want to talk about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and more specifically about the status of the Ukrainian offensive, now reaching almost 3 months of fighting. I want to start by looking at the map. This is liveuamap.com. It's a pro-Ukrainian source, so please keep that in mind while we look at it. And looking at it from a distance, the line of contact is virtually unchanged. And only upon zooming in do you see minor areas of advance made by Ukraine. The map does not show the layers and layers of defenses Russia created over the course of several months, and layers of defenses that Ukrainian advances, even the most optimistic projections, these have not even reached the first layers of Russia's defensive lines. And then, of course, if we go to the Donbas region and we go north near Kharkov, we will see Russian forces making an advance towards Kupiansk. And what we're actually looking at is in the middle of a failing Ukrainian offensive, now in its third month. We are actually watching Russian forces overturning the territorial gains made by Ukraine in their previous offensive in the fall of last year. So that's where we are right now on the map. Let's take a look at some of the articles talking about what is going on the battlefield right now. This is from New York Times. Fighting intensifies in northeast as Russia presses on Kupiansk. So this is not just Russia claiming this. This is even the Western media admitting this. The New York Times article says, fierce fighting has been raging around the Ukrainian city of Kupiansk in recent weeks as Russian forces make concerted attacks on nearby villages, the only area along the front line where Moscow's troops are making noticeable gains. And the New York Times is trying to downplay these gains, but it has to be remembered that this is in the middle of Ukraine's offensive. The fact that Russia is making any gains at all in the middle of Ukraine's offensive is actually very noteworthy, is not something that you can rationally or objectively downplay. There's also articles like this from Ukraine Pravda via Yahoo News. Ukraine's offensive success in south is successful. Russia's in Kharkiv Oblast is not. UK intelligence. I think they need to work on that headline a little bit. The article goes on and says most of the contact line in Ukraine remained unchanged over the past week. However, in the south, Ukrainian forces have continued their advance along the course of the Mokry Yali River, securing the village of Urozhaina. In the face of stiff Russian resistance, the UK intelligence said Russian troops continued testing attacks instead, but did not achieve significant success in the area of Kupiansk in Kharkiv Oblast, the review says. And then they quote the UK intelligence report saying, across the front, both sides confront a similar challenge, attempting to defeat well-entrenched forces while having limited, uncommitted forces to open new assaults. And notice how the UK military intelligence briefing says that Russia is not achieving significant success. But that is not a denial that they are having some sort of success. The thing to remember about what Russia is doing, again, in the middle of Ukraine's offensive, and these gains they claim Ukraine is making, is that Ukraine is still working in Russia's security zone. This is an area where Russia is fully willing to give up territory whenever it needs to. The whole point of the security zone is to conduct a mobile defense, to hit and run enemy forces, to absorb, deflect, and if necessary, withdraw from significant enemy assaults. That is what has been going on in the security zone all of this time. The fact that after now 2 going on to 3 months of fighting, Ukraine still has not made it through just the security zone, that says a lot about the state of Ukraine's forces and also the significance of Russia's defenses. I want to point out that even this goal of reaching the Sea of Azov, cutting the land bridge, and then being in range to attack and destroy the Crimean bridge to somehow isolate the Crimean Peninsula, to then pick apart the forces there and eventually take back the Crimean Peninsula. This whole notion is fundamentally flawed, and I've pointed it out many times before, how the Crimean Peninsula was returned to Russia, became part of the Russian Federation in 2014, how the bridge wasn't built until 2018, and how the land bridge wasn't established until 2022. The Crimean Peninsula can be sustained without either the land bridge or the Crimean bridge. It had been for years. It could be again for years to come, especially with everything that is at stake, and considering the fact that Russia has proven its ability to sustain significant military operations using just airlift and sea lift capabilities. So this whole concept, the whole objective of the Ukrainian offensive from the very beginning is fundamentally flawed, and it's not even close to achieving any of those objectives laid out anyway. Now, despite all of these attempts by the UK military intelligence reviews, other Western headlines, Ukrainian media to try to spin what is happening on the battlefield, there is a growing number of Western media articles admitting that the Ukrainian offensive is essentially failing and that there is no plan B for Ukraine to go to. Alexander Mikuris and Alex Christoforou of the Duran, I highly recommend the Duran and the individual channels of both Alex and Alexander. They have been covering this daily. They have been going through these news articles on a daily basis, breaking them down. They've done an excellent job. One of the articles that they talked about was this one from Financial Times. U.S. grows doubtful Ukraine counteroffensive can quickly succeed. So let's just take a look at everything that they say in this article. Let's see what the state of this offensive is according to the Western media now. The U.S. and Ukraine originally planned for a spring offensive that would quickly roll back Russian occupying forces in the summer. But slow progress on the ground has prompted Kiev to revert to more traditional tactics rather than the combined arms maneuvers the U.S. and its Western allies taught them in Europe earlier this year. They're talking about combined arms, NATO-style maneuver warfare. The offensive began in early June, so they're saying they had about 6 months to learn how to do this. So they took in many instances raw conscripts and just gave them 6 months of training, which is barely enough to produce an entry-level infantryman. But they thought they were going to put a combined arms force together that would be able to successfully and effectively carry out NATO-style maneuver warfare. That is a fantasy. And we could already see the blame game beginning here. We taught them how to do this, but they weren't able to. You cannot teach a military force to do this in 6 months. That is impossible. So NATO is blaming Ukraine for something that they themselves are responsible for. The article continues, "We're doing everything we can to support Ukraine in its counteroffensive," said Jake Sullivan, U.S. National Security Advisor. "We're not going to handicap the outcome. We're not going to predict what's going to happen because this war has been inherently unpredictable." But is it really unpredictable? Is any of this unpredictable? The article continues. It says, Ukrainians continue to make some small gains this week. They talk about these villages that they've liberated. Then it says, U.S. officials are privately girding for what increasingly looks like a war of attrition that will last well into next year, while publicly reiterating continued support for Kiev. Then it says, one point of tension between U.S. and Ukrainian officials has centered on how Kiev has deployed its military. U.S. officials have encouraged Ukraine to be less risk adverse and fully commit its forces to the main axis of the counteroffensive in the south, so it would have a chance of breaking through Russian lines to reach the Sea of Azov, effectively cutting Russia's land bridge in southern Ukraine to Crimea, a critical military hub. And I've talked about this many times, how even if they did manage to do that, it is not going to have the effect they think it will. It also says, Washington has also urged Ukraine to send more combat power to the south and stop concentrating on the east, where almost half of its forces are engaged. But Ukraine has instead deployed some of its best fighting units in eastern Ukraine in a battle to recapture Bakhmut. And remember, before the first shot was fired in this most recent Ukrainian offensive, they had committed their best troops to fighting a failed battle to prevent Russia from taking Bakhmut in the first place. I remember very well covering all of that and talking about how even before the offensive began, They were degrading their best trained, best equipped troops in their stubborn, failed defense of Bakhmut. The article continues. Officials in Kiev, including President Vladimir Zelensky and some of the Biden administration's critics, have called for the West to offer Ukraine heavy weaponry and say the counteroffensive's progress will remain slow unless Washington sends more long-range fire and air power to support it. And again, what heavy weapons can the West send that they haven't already that is going to make any sort of difference? And people will say F-16s and attack of missiles, and I will say that is not going to have any effect. And I will get into other Western media articles that even admit as much. What does all of this sound like? And this is what Alexander Mikouros was explaining in his video. This is the blame game. The offensive is failing, and the United States is beginning to blame Ukraine. Ukraine is blaming the US and Europe, and I'm sure the blame will continue to be traded as things continue to unravel. We also have this article. This is from a little bit earlier in the week, August 17th, 2023. US intelligence says Ukraine will fail to meet offensive's key goal. Thwarted by minefields, Ukrainian forces won't reach the southeastern city of Melitopol, a vital Russian transit hub, according to a US intelligence assessment. The article talks about how they imagine this offensive unfolded. It says Ukraine launched the counteroffensive in early June, hoping to replicate its stunning success in last fall's push through the Kharkiv region. But I've talked about the offensives last year and how they were catastrophic failures. Again, they were fighting a war of attrition. They traded their army and their equipment in for territory that they were not going to be able to hold. And now we see in the middle of their current offensive, Russia reversing the gains they made in their offensive last fall. Article continues. But in the first week of fighting, Ukraine incurred major casualties against Russia's well-prepared defenses, despite having a range of newly acquired Western equipment, including US Bradley fighting vehicles, German-made Leopard 2 tanks, and specialized mine-clearing vehicles. And I talked about this for many months, how you cannot just transfer brand new weapon systems that troops have no experience using and expect them to use them effectively. It could take months, could even take years to fully incorporate a new weapon system into a military, let alone multiple weapon systems all at once. This was unrealistic, and it was doomed to failure before it was even attempted. Then it says, joint war games conducted by the US, British, and Ukrainian militaries anticipated such losses, but envisioned Kiev accepting the casualties as the cost of piercing through Russia's main defensive line, said US and Western officials. But Ukraine chose to stem the losses on the battlefield and switch to a tactic of relying on smaller units to push forward across different areas of the front. That resulted in Ukraine making incremental gains in different pockets over the summer. Kiev has recently dedicated more reserves to the front, including Striker and Challenger units, but has yet to break through Russia's main defensive line. And I would like to point out that these Striker and Challenger units, that is the very last of what they had. They had the Leopards, they had Soviet-era modified T-72s from Poland, they had the Challenger 2s and the Strikers. And if that's all now on the battlefield, that means everything is on the battlefield, and they have not even reached the first line of defense yet. And in reality, they're talking about these war games that they conducted. And they said, you will break through, guaranteed, you will break through Russia's defenses, but it's going to cost you this many men. And are we expected to believe that Ukraine saw that, understood that, and then for some reason their nerve broke in the middle of the actual offensive, and they decided to abandon that and switch tactics? Is that what we're expected to believe? So I will tell you something. Sending armor and infantry through minefields without air cover and without sufficient artillery is suicide. That's what it is. It's suicide. And if Ukraine continued feeding troops and equipment into those minefields, the only thing that would have changed would be the size of burning heaps of NATO armor and the size of the piles of dead Ukrainians. That's the only thing that would have changed. You cannot breach minefields this way. That is not how NATO would attempt to breach a minefield. That is not how Ukraine would have been able to breach the minefield. I think that's very clear by now. The article continues, the path to Melitopol is an extremely challenging one, and even recapturing closer cities such as Tokmak will be difficult, said Rob Lee, a military analyst with the Foreign Policy Research Institute. If you follow Rob Lee, say, on Twitter, he's one of these guys who's very optimistic about the Ukrainian offensive going in, who's always reporting on all of this Russian equipment being wiped out and how incompetent the Russians are and how well the Ukrainians are doing. Now his tune really sounds like it has changed. Russia has 3 main defensive lines there and then fortified cities after that, he said. It's not just a question about whether Ukraine can breach 1 or 2 of them, but can they breach all 3 and have enough forces available after taking attrition to achieve something more significant like taking Tokmak or something beyond that. And this is what I said. Again, 4 months before the offensive even began, I talked about how no matter where the Ukrainian military ends on the map, even if they end up at the Sea of Azov, they will be a depleted force. They will not have enough manpower or equipment to even hold the territory that they gained, let alone expand on that. And this was the exact same problem they had last year after their successful offensives last fall in Kharkov and Kherson. The Washington Post starts talking about the wonder weapons, more talk about wonder weapons that will finally change the tide in Ukraine's favor. It says U.S. officials reject criticisms that F-16 fighter jets or longer-range missile systems such as ATACMS would have resulted in a different outcome. The problem remains piercing Russia's main defensive line, and there's no evidence these systems would have been a panacea, a senior administration official said. And in reality, to pierce these minefields, you would need longer-range missiles like ATACMS, and you would need air power, including through the use of F-16s. But there's absolutely no way for the United States to transfer these capabilities to Ukraine and have Ukraine effectively use them in time for this offensive to have been successful. That is impossible. That will never happen. Then the Washington Post quotes the U.S. chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley. This is what it says. It says, while not achieving its objectives, he noted Kiev's success in degrading Russian forces. The Russians are in pretty rough shape, he said. They've suffered a huge amount of casualties. Their morale is not great. And 2 things to say about this. Whatever you want to say about Russian losses, you have to say twice as much about Ukraine's losses. And this talk about low Russian morale, this has been part of the narrative since the special military operation began in February 2022. Russian forces are always in bad shape, always have bad morale, poor leadership. All of their ammunition and equipment are disappearing. But then all of these narratives don't actually manifest themselves in the reality on the battlefield. The article continues. It says, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba on Tuesday acknowledged the slow pace of Ukraine's counteroffensive, but said Kiev would not stop fighting till all of its land is retaken, which is just utterly delusional. You have not even made it up to the first defensive line. Your army is depleted. You can talk about retaking all of your land, but that's not going to change the reality of the situation that you're in. This sounds like bunker talk to me. We don't care how long it takes, he told news agency AFP. He encouraged critics of the offensive to go and join the Foreign Legion if they wanted faster results. It's easy to say that you want everything to be faster when you are not there, he said. And so this is the foreign minister of a country, Ukraine, basically losing his mind, losing his temper, having an emotional outburst. And does this indicate a nation and a military operation that is under control, or does this sound like something that the wheels are falling off of? The article continues. It goes on and it says, Ukrainian officials have said privately that timing depends on how quickly forces can penetrate the minefields, a difficult process that has strained the military's mine-clearing resources across a wide swath of territory. And I've discussed this at length. I've talked about Ukraine using U.S. tactics to fight the Russian battalion tactical group, this basic military unit with incredible firepower. It's relatively small, but has tremendous firepower. And the way the U.S. proposed to deal with this military unit was because you can't outfight them toe-to-toe at long range. What you have to do is you have to close the gap as quickly as possible, storm their positions, inflict as much damage on them as possible, compel them to withdraw. That was the whole plan. And we saw Ukraine doing that in Kupiansk. Luckily, there were hardly any Russian forces there to begin with Kharkov, including Kupiansk. We also saw them doing that in Kherson with very, very mixed results. And I've talked about how prepared defenses, not even discussing the minefields, the trenches, the tank traps, the dragon's teeth, how they were layered, how they are staggered. And the purpose of that is to prevent Ukraine from closing that gap as quickly as possible, forcing them to maneuver on the battlefield in between these obstacles, to cross over or breach these obstacles, which keeps them on the battlefield longer, keeps them in the line of Russian fire longer, so that Russia can inflict maximum damage on them long before they come in range and are able to inflict heavy losses on the battalion tactical group. That is what Russia has achieved through the use of minefields and then these trenches, tank traps, dragon's teeth that Ukraine has not even reached yet. They're able to keep Ukrainian forces attempting to rush toward and overwhelm Russian positions. They're able to keep them on the battlefield long enough so that long-range Russian weaponry can just waylay to all of them. That is what we've been watching for almost 3 months now. I've also talked about how U.S. military doctrine in regards to clearing minefields requires the U.S. to use its air superiority and its advantage in artillery and other long-range weapons to clear out enemy forces on the opposite end of the minefield. The purpose of doing that is so that your engineers can clear the minefield and not worried about being fired upon. However, Ukraine does not have air power. They do not have a significant advantage in artillery or any other type of long-range fire. So they're trying to clear these minefields while constantly under fire. And what this results in is just piles of burning armor and dead Ukrainian soldiers. It is an impossible task that the US has given Ukraine. The idea that all Ukraine had to do was just persist in sending wave after wave of armor and soldier over these minefields until eventually Russia ran out of mines to kill Ukrainians and destroy their vehicles. The idea of doing that until you broke through the defenses and then somehow you would have won it's madness. It is absolute madness. Again, they would have reached the Sea of Azov if that was even possible without anything resembling an actual army left. The article continues. It says, analysts say the challenges Ukraine has faced are multifaceted, but nearly all agree that Russia surpassed expectations when it comes to the proficiency in defending occupied territory. The most deterministic factor of how this offensive has gone thus far is the quality of Russian defenses, said Lee, this Rob Lee guy again. Noting Russia's use of trenches, mines, and aviation. They had a lot of time and they prepared them very well and made it very difficult for Ukraine to advance. Was this an expectation that was reasonably surpassed? I don't think so. And I want to point out a couple of articles that I have endlessly returned to before the offensive was launched this year, explaining the failure of Ukraine's supposedly successful offensives last year and how this all predicted the failure of Ukraine's offensive this year. So the first one, and I've gone over this one many times, this is from the Washington Post, September 2022. Wounded Ukrainian soldiers reveal steep toll of Kherson offensive. If you go through this article, and the link to it is in the video description below, they talk about the incredibly lopsided nature of the fighting around Kherson, and it was lopsided decisively in Russia's favor. Ukraine, just as they are trying now, threw themselves at Russian defenses over and over and over again, and each time Russia was able to destroy their equipment, kill their soldiers. Every once in a while, Ukraine would successfully produce an assault strong enough to compel Russian soldiers to retreat. Then they would carry out a counteroffensive, take that territory back. And it went on and on and on like that until Russian commanders decided that they did not want this large force stranded on the opposite side of the Dnieper River, that they wanted them on the east bank along with the rest of Russia's forces to face the upcoming offensive, which Ukraine was already talking about and their allies were already talking about, the offensive that they are now parrying at this moment. If you take that article and you add it to this one from December 2022, another article that I've endlessly returned to, the New York Times, defenses carved into the earth. Russia is building a vast network of trenches, traps, and obstacles to slow Ukraine's momentum. Will it work? I think we have the answer to that now. And again, as I always point out, they have satellite images, maps where these layers and layers of defensive positions were created. They show pictures of the defenses. They have diagrams explaining the function of these different obstacles. And if you put that together with the lopsided nature of the fighting around Kherson during Ukraine's offensive last year, if you put all of that together, it spells doom for Ukraine's offensive this year. There was no surprise. There was no expectation that was exceeded by Russia's performance on the battlefield. This is exactly how Russia fought last year around Kherson. Now they're doing it with the addition of these defenses that the New York Times talked about in December. So if you couldn't put this together and see what Ukrainian forces were faced with upon launching their offensive, and I think that you can't see anything at all. Here's another article. Again, many people have already covered this, but I think it's worth repeating. The Washington Post, Ukraine's running out of options to retake significant territory. This was just yesterday. The article says, Russia and Ukraine are now in an attrition phase, attempting to sap each other's resources rather than secure significant territorial advances. With its ground forces largely stymied, Ukraine has mounted a flurry of new drone strikes on Russian soil, including targets in Moscow, but the strikes have caused minimal damage. It continues. It says, when asked about the counteroffensive's progress, Western and Ukrainian officials call for patience, describing the fight as slower than expected, but insisting that it is steadily making gains. However, the window of time for Ukraine to conduct offensive operations is limited. Last year, Ukrainian forces made little progress after recapturing the southern city of Kherson in early November as inhospitable weather set in, and also the fact that after the city of Kherson is the Dnieper River, and there was no way Ukrainian forces were going to be able to cross it, especially with Russia having consolidated its position on the other side. And more than changing weather, there are other factors that are going to limit Ukraine's abilities as time goes by. Every single day that goes by, Ukraine has less ammunition, less weapons to fire that ammunition with, and less trained manpower to operate those weapons. So it truly is a war of attrition. And if you are in a war of attrition, attempting to trade your army in for territory, you are in the process of losing. The article continues. It says, with its ground forces advancing slowly, Ukraine is using drone strikes to expand its military reach as it waits for more advanced munitions and training, including greater air power, said an advisor to Ukraine's Minister of Defense. We don't have the F-16s yet, so we have to find a way to make up for their absence, and drones are somewhat used to compensate for the lack of aviation, he said. What more advanced munitions and training are they talking about? What air power are they talking about? I'm gonna talk a little bit more about the F-16s here in just a moment, but this is more of the wonder weapon talk, and this is what people are doing instead of facing reality. They're still talking about wonder weapons. But then the article addresses this talk of using drones, these drone attacks, and what they're actually achieving. And it says, analysts caution that while the drone attacks can shift attention away from Ukraine's slow-moving ground counteroffensive, they are unlikely to tip the balance of the war in Kiev's favor. That's right. And I've talked about this. Alexander Mikuras of the Duran has talked about this. He read from an article from The Guardian. citing Western analysts who admitted that this is psychological warfare. This is for public relations. This is not going to change the war at all in favor of Ukraine. And in many ways, it's causing more and more Russian people to side with and support the government in the special military operations, having exactly the opposite effect that they imagined that it would. Then the article talks about long-range strikes using, I'm assuming, using weapon systems like HIMARS, this multiple launch rocket system that uses GPS-guided rockets. And also these Storm Shadow cruise missiles that allow Ukraine to hit targets deep in enemy territory. The article says Ukraine has been also striking Russian logistical targets with longer range munitions far from the front line for months. But so far, the effect of such strikes has not been reflected on the Russian front line. The Russian position has deteriorated, but it hasn't deteriorated to the degree where you could expect an imminent collapse. A campaign of longer range strikes, also referred to as deep battle, can be described as successful when the opponent's forces can no longer call on reserve forces or conduct basic support functions like resupply. Rather than crumble, however, Russian forces are putting up fierce resistance and even making offensive advances. And this is what was pointed out before even the first HIMARS arrived on the battlefield in Ukraine. I pointed out that if this was a war-winning capability, Russia would win the war much sooner than Ukraine, because Russia has many more of these type of systems. Their systems are more capable than the ones being sent to Ukraine. Russia knows how to use them more effectively. They also have weapon systems that far exceed the capabilities of either the HIMARS or the Storm Shadow. Russia can hit any target inside Ukraine, anywhere at any time, with its cruise missiles, and also with its Garan 2 drones. So the idea of using HIMARS and now the Storm Shadow to hit logistical targets and disrupt Russian logistics, again, this was a fantasy. If Ukraine is able to do that to Russia, well, Russia is also able to do it to Ukraine. Whatever circumstances Russia is struggling under, so is Ukraine, but to a wider degree. Another thing that you have to remember is that Russia knows what the range of the HIMARS and the Storm Shadow are, and they know how frequently they're targeted with these weapons, and they can disperse their logistics accordingly. And then beyond the range of these weapon systems, they don't have to really worry about that. And they have a very extensive military industrial capacity far beyond the range of any sort of significant Ukrainian threat. On the other hand, as I pointed out, Russia can hit any target within Ukraine. Their entire logistical rear is exposed. Some might argue that Ukraine's genuine logistical rear is, say, in Poland or even beyond, all across Europe, far out of reach of Russian weapons. We have to remember that the combined military industrial output of the West, the US and Europe, is still outmatched by Russia. So if you have nations able to inflict damage on each other's logistics, then it comes down to who has the larger military industrial capacity, and that is Russia. You also have to remember that if you're Ukraine and your logistical rear begins somewhere in Poland, it's about 1,000 kilometers or more from the front line. That is much further than Russia has to move back its logistical hubs and maintenance facilities. That means that, say, a Leopard 2 tank that isn't completely destroyed has to make a 1,000 kilometer trip to Poland to be repaired, and then another 1,000 kilometer trip or more to return to the battlefield. That is extremely inefficient. You're going to be at a disadvantage if you're doing that and your enemy does not have to do that. And now the Western media is finally admitting this notion of using HIMARS and Storm Shadow and other long-range weapons to disrupt Russian logistics, command and control, and everything else, that really is implausible, that it's not happening. To whatever degree Ukraine is able to inflict damage on Russia, Russia is able to inflict much more damage on Ukraine, and Russia is able to sustain its losses much easier than Ukraine and the rest of NATO can at this point. Now, despite the Western media finally coming to grips with reality, we're still hearing about wonder weapons. We're still talking about at least F-16s at this point. So this is from DW. Ukraine updates. Netherlands, Denmark to send F-16s to Kiev. And there's President Zelensky walking around an F-16. The article says both Denmark and the Netherlands confirmed that the transfer of planes would take place when the conditions were right. Whatever that means. The confirmation comes as Ukrainian pilots start training to operate F-16 fighter jets, with the process likely to take at least 6 months, but probably a lot longer. Then they talk about Denmark sending perhaps 19 F-16s to Ukraine and the Netherlands sending up to 42. Then there's a Reuters article somewhere here that talk about, while they do have 42 F-16s that they're talking about sending, only 24 of them are operational. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how many F-16s NATO sends to Ukraine. They're going to have the exact same problem, but just on a much larger scale than sending NATO main battle tanks to Ukraine. You cannot train pilots this quickly. So just 6 months, you're not going to be able to have them transfer from Soviet-era warplanes to F-16s and have them carry out effective missions. And also remember that Ukraine started out with an air force at the beginning of Russia's special military operation. It was destroyed on the ground. What was left of it was destroyed in the air by Russian air defense systems and also air-to-air capabilities. And the exact same thing is going to happen to these F-16s. There's nothing special about these F-16s that make them less susceptible to being destroyed on the ground or in the air by Russian capabilities. There's something else to consider. Despite Russia's vast advantage over Ukraine in terms of air power, it was only until relatively recently that their warplanes have been able to operate along the line of contact using glide bombs to hit targets in enemy territory. And this was done after a very long-term methodical campaign to exhaust Ukrainian air defense capabilities. Ukraine is not going to be able to conduct a similar campaign against Russian air defense capabilities. That will never happen. And so the idea of F-16s operating anywhere along the line of contact is, again, a fantasy. People are not thinking this all the way through to its logical conclusion, just like they failed to think through all of the actual realities that prevented Ukraine from using NATO main battle tanks effectively on the battlefield. These very same factors, but just on a larger scale, are going to prevent Ukraine from using F-16s effectively over the battlefield. So what happens next when Ukraine's offensive does finally exhaust itself, which it hasn't yet, and people should not assume that there will be no major developments in favor of Ukraine until evidence emerges that it has actually completely failed. People should reserve assuming anything. There could still be breakthroughs. The Russian defenses are still very much designed to give way to a significant Ukrainian assault, which could still be organized, cobbled together, and launched. That can still happen. But what happens afterwards? Because again, no matter what Ukraine manages to pull off from this point onward, wherever it ends on the map, it'll be an exhausted force. The Ukrainian military will be an exhausted force. What does Russia do next? And I hear a lot of talk about a Russian offensive being launched in the wake of Ukraine's offensive failing. We already see Russia conducting an offensive of sorts around Kupiansk. This is how Russia conducts its offensives. It does it in a very methodical, incremental, grinding manner. It's not going to launch these big arrow assaults like Ukraine has been trying to, because Russia understands that it too will lose huge amounts of manpower and equipment. They don't have to do that because they have an advantage in long-range fires. They can methodically, incrementally wear down Ukrainian defenses, and then they can storm forward when they are certain those defenses have been degraded significantly enough to minimize the risk to the men and the equipment storming those positions. And that is how Russia has been managing its offensive operations throughout the entire special military operations, save for the opening phase. And I believe that that's how they're going to continue conducting their offensives. And I don't think we will see these sweeping big arrow assaults until there is a decisive and, I would say, almost complete collapse of Ukraine's fighting capacity. If and when that happens, then you might see sweeping movements made by Russian forces. Until then, I think we should be prepared for a very incremental, systematic, and patient offensive strategy, as we've seen in Bakhmut, as we see now around Kupiansk, as we saw around Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and even as we saw around Mariupol, the taking of that city there. I think Russia will continue grinding its way forward on the battlefield until it achieves all of its objectives. What are those objectives? We have to remember that the official objectives of the special military operation are to demilitarize Ukraine, to denazify Ukraine, and to protect the Donbas region. And we can see all of those objectives being incrementally achieved. But then again, there was also the incorporation of Zaporozhye and Kherson, along with the Donbas region, into the Russian Federation. That was not part of the official special military operations objectives, but it took place anyway. So there's a lot of speculation that Russia might be interested in incorporating other oblasts, possibly Kharkov, possibly Odessa. There may even be a desire to take everything up to the east bank of the Dnieper River. We'll have to wait and see. It's all speculation at this point. One thing that we should keep in mind, however, is that at the very beginning of all of this, in 2014, when the US overthrew the elected government of Ukraine, obviously Crimea rejoined Russia, joining the Russian Federation that same year. But beyond that, Ukraine could have maintained territorial integrity, and all it had to do was uphold the Minsk agreements, which it in principle agreed to, but it never upheld. And now, in hindsight, we know, we've heard German politicians as well as Ukrainian leaders all admit that the Minsk agreements were never meant to be upheld. They simply used it to buy time to build up their military for a military confrontation with Russia. So by 2022, they got that military confrontation. And instead of upholding the Minsk agreement and maintaining the territorial integrity of what was left of Ukraine, they lost the Donbas region. The Russian military swept in, took the Donbas region, and that was it. Then they had the opportunity to negotiate again, and they refused to. They wanted everything back. They wanted the Donbas back. They wanted Crimea back. So what did Russia do? They took Zaporozhye and Kherson. These are oblasts that Russia will never willingly give up. They will never be returned to Ukraine, not willfully. The fighting continues, and I can only imagine that Russia will take more and more and more. And every day that goes by that Ukraine and its Western sponsors refuse to negotiate, the deal will be worse and worse for Ukraine. But as I pointed out on a live stream with Danny Haifang on his channel yesterday, this is a proxy war the US is fighting against Russia using Ukraine. They're paying for this proxy war in Ukrainian blood and Ukrainian territory, and in the prospects of Ukraine's society, economy, and infrastructure well into the future. As long as they're paying with somebody else's blood and with somebody else's territory, others are facing the consequences of this proxy war. The US has no incentive to negotiate an end to this conflict. It really does look like it will be to the last Ukrainian. It really does. Unfortunately for Ukraine, that still seems to be the plan. So we have to keep a close eye on all of this. I will continue following events on the ground and doing updates as necessary. Again, if you want daily updates and excellent updates, please follow Alexander Micuris and Alex Christoforou of the Duran. They do an excellent daily job doing updates. I do updates at least once a week on the situation in Ukraine. If you thought this update was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do and it helps the channel grow. Please check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I post very actively on Telegram. I post everything up there, including full videos there as a backup for YouTube. My YouTube videos are also automatically backed up on Odyssey and Rumble. Also check the video description for all of the links that I referenced in this video. Every article that I go over, the link should be in the video description so that you could read it for yourself. Also in the video description are ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel. If an ad ever for some reason pops up, feel free to skip it. It's not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, thank you so much. That is what makes this work possible, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or even if you're just helping share my work with others and getting the word out there. I greatly appreciate all of that. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.